The Old Testament law was supposed to be a set of pointers for Israel, saying, Israel, if you obey these commands, then you'll be on your way to living the way I created human beings to live. And you can see a lot of the values that God embeds in that Old Testament law. Taking care of the poor and the weak, making sure that people can't amass a whole lot of wealth and power to oppress one another. A high value on forgiveness, on hospitality, all kinds of things like this. And God said to Israel, your job as my special people is to follow this law. And the law isn't your condition, your entry requirement to something better. The law is, in large part, your reward. Because Israel, if you follow it, you get to experience life a lot more the way I created you to be. And when you look at that law and compare it to what Israel's neighbors were doing, you can see, wow, yeah. Israel's law prevented them from rampant slavery. Israel's law prevented them from engaging in blood vengeance, where if you get a family feud and somebody kills somebody in your family, so you go and kill somebody in their family and it escalates indefinitely. There are all kinds of ways in which Israel's law really did curb our tendency to violence, to hatred, to all of the things that are destructive. And the law really did, if people followed it, move them much closer to the kind of relationships with one another and with God that we were intended to live. That's why Paul says in Romans that the law was holy and good. The problem with the law was not that it was a set of rules. The problem with the law was simply that Israel and human beings in general found it impossible to obey, found it impossible to choose to follow it consistently. And so Jesus, when he's coming in Matthew's gospel, is offering a solution to our weakness. And at the end of Matthew's gospel, we're going to be told, that Jesus dies as our final sacrifice. That just as the law itself offered sacrifices as a way for God to forgive people when they messed up, Jesus' final sacrifice gives us a kind of forgiveness that we need in order to be able to relate to God at all. And the New Testament promises us the Spirit of God to help us to choose to do the right thing when we can't in our own strength. But underneath all of that grace and gift, there's still that basic problem that what we're being invited to in the kingdom of God is, in part, a community where we live differently and we treat one another differently. And so that original pattern of life that the law was made to point to for Israel, that hasn't changed. God hasn't changed his mind about the kind of life he made us to live. That's why Jesus can say so strongly, right at the outset, when he's going to say, this is how life looks in the kingdom of God, he's going to say, I'm not telling you that the law needs to be thrown out. I'm coming to fulfill the law. I'm going to show you and help you to understand that original creation lifestyle that God made you to live, that the law was always pointing to, so that now you can actually live it. And that's a big part of what salvation means. So, that's all fine and well, but if that's the case, then why does Paul say we're free from the law? And Luke in the book of Acts says pretty well the same thing. Shows us Peter having a vision where he's told by God in a vision, the food laws don't apply anymore. So how do we reconcile this in the Sermon on the Mount with that? Well, part of the answer here is that Luke and Paul find themselves in a different situation than Jesus was when he gave the Sermon on the Mount. And often we forget this, that between Jesus' earthly teaching and the letters of Paul, there are some crucial events that change the situation radically. One of those events is Jesus' death on the cross as a sacrifice for us. Well, if Jesus has become the final sacrifice for us, then that changes the significance of all of the Old Testament laws around sacrifice, right? And the Old Testament laws around the festivals. It's not that those laws are done away with, but the Pharisees themselves and the Jewish teachers of the law always presumed that the law had to be applied flexibly. After all, if you're a farmer and there are laws about farming and what you can and can't sow in your fields, and then you move to the city, well, those farming laws don't apply to you anymore. Not because the laws have changed, but because your situation has changed. And similarly, early Christians seem to have agreed very quickly that with the death of Christ as a sacrifice for us, we no longer needed to offer sacrifices the same way we used to for our forgiveness. So that's one significant area of law in the Old Testament, in Exodus, in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, that we can see, oh yeah, we wouldn't practice anymore as followers of Jesus. And along with that set of laws about sacrifice would go the set of laws about ritual purity, or what in some translations is called cleanness and uncleanness. Why? Because ritual purity was about preparing yourself to enter the temple to offer sacrifice. It didn't matter if you were ritually impure anywhere else, only when you were going to go up to Jerusalem to enter the temple. So all of those laws about, having to immerse yourself in water and wash your hands and all of those sorts of things, we don't practice fairly obviously because we're not offering sacrifices anymore. But Paul and Luke seem to push a little bit further than this and say, well, it's not just that we're living in a different situation and so we have to apply the law differently. At times, Paul and Luke really do seem to say, we're now outside the law. We're outside the law's jurisdiction. And one of the basic reasons for that is that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is speaking to Jews. All of his disciples are Jews. His audience is made up of Jews. His audience then is made up of the people of Israel to whom the Mosaic law was given specifically. And there was always the assumption that some of this law might be specifically for Israel, and the rest of the law would then reflect God's universal will for humanity. It was a surprise to the early Christians when, within about 10 years, there were more Gentiles, non-Jews, in the church than there were Jews. And so this is another way where Paul and Luke and we are standing in a different position than Jesus was standing. Why? Because we're all, at least for the most part of that non-Jewish body of believers in Jesus. And very early on, the Christian communities became convinced that God wasn't calling all of us Gentiles to come and become Jews to follow Jesus, but that God was welcoming us as Gentiles to come and follow Jesus. So that meant that we weren't necessarily obligated to keep the law that was set up with Moses. But there's a danger there, And the danger is that it's easy for us Gentiles then to think, well, that's great. I get to be in on the kingdom of God, and I don't have to do a thing. I don't have to live any differently. I can eat bacon. I can shop on Saturday. I can wear cotton polyester blend shirts. And I get to be part of the kingdom of God, and I get forgiveness through Jesus. Fantastic. But you'll notice that Paul and Luke are both really emphatic about saying that's not how it works. In Romans chapter 6, Paul spends the whole chapter saying, just because you're not obligated to keep all of the commands of the Old Testament law, you Gentiles, doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. Why? Because of the same thing that Jesus is pointing to here. Because what we're saved for is a changed life, to be part of a changed community, to be part of a new creation community. And we can't be part of that community if we're not changed in the way we relate to one another. And so, although Matthew, when he reports Jesus' teaching here, doesn't frame it quite the same way that Paul does, when Jesus says, "Don't think I've come to abolish the law," the message for us Gentiles is really the same thing that Paul is saying in Romans 6. Don't think I've come to get rid of all the rules so you can do whatever you want. Don't think my purpose in restoring creation has changed. Don't think this means that now you've just got a ticket to heaven in your back pocket and you can live the same way you always did. The destination is still the same as it was for Israel. The destination is still a kingdom of God in which we relate to one another in life-giving ways instead of violent ways. And so Jesus says, you've got to have righteousness greater than that of the Pharisees and the scribes. Not by being more detailed in your obedience, but by pushing beyond what the law says and recognizing that the law itself was just a pointer. It doesn't get us the whole way. So if the law says don't kill one another, don't murder, that's a great start. And it was a really good start for Israel to not murder one another. But that doesn't get us all the way to the kingdom of God, to a kingdom of God lifestyle. The kingdom of God involves more than just not killing each other. It involves us asking, what makes us kill one another? What makes us want to kill one another? You know, is it that I look at you and I think I can judge you based on the way you've hurt me, and so I think I know you're worthy of death? Well, we can not kill one another and still look at one another that way, can't we? But if we begin to absorb the fact that, hey, maybe I don't have the right to judge you, maybe there's always more to you than what I think I see, then maybe I will get angry at you a little less often. Maybe I will hold on to my rage a little less tightly. Maybe one of the things that makes me feel like I can kill someone is simply that I think my pain or my happiness is more important than their pain and their happiness. And so if I really absorb the fact that I'm not more important than you are, then maybe I'll hang on to my anger and my hatred and my resentment less tightly, because I'll realize there's another human being on the other end of my anger. And I'll be forced to think about what my anger is doing to them, let alone what it's doing to me. That's what Jesus is beginning to do as we move on into the Sermon on the Mount. To say, this is what the law taught Israel. It brought us part of the way. Now, like an arrow that's pointed at a target, look down that arrow and see where it's aimed. And think about the lifestyle it's pointing toward. So if the law says don't kill, Jesus says, that's not bad, but I'm telling you, think beyond that. Ask where that's pointing. And I'm telling you, don't even harbor anger and hatred against one another. Jesus says, I'm telling you, when you're in traffic and somebody cuts you off, don't even say, you idiot! Because if we really understand that the law is pointing to something even more intense, even more different than our everyday life, we'll realize that that's not a kingdom of God way of being with one another. So Jesus doesn't lay down in the Sermon on the Mount either every detail of what a kingdom of God lifestyle looks like, but he gives us glimpses of it and then says, okay, this is your project, this is your invitation, and this is in large part your reward, that you can learn to live the life that Israel's law was supposed to produce in Israel, that you can learn to live a restored, new creation way of life with one another. And as we do that together, we begin to actually experience the kingdom of God, the community of God together, because you treat me differently, and I treat you differently. It doesn't mean we're going to do it perfectly, and we're still going to let one another down. And my kids can tell you that I am far from perfectly obedient to this kingdom of God lifestyle. But Jesus is saying right at the beginning, it's not optional. This is what salvation is. This is what we're invited to.